Thank you so much for joining me at these odd hours from wherever you are joining me from. So today we're going to be talking about reporting from margins, journalism from exile. Amid increasing threats to press freedom and the safety of journalists worldwide, the role of journalists in exile is a critical topic of concern. As transnational displacements increase, the growing experience of journalists working across professional and also geographical boundaries while in exile makes it timely to explore how living in exile affects ability to maintain journalistic independence. The efficacy of collaborative journalistic efforts in this context is also drawing much attention, both from journalism scholars and journalists themselves. In today's webinar, we bring together journalists from the South Asian and MENA region to offer insights from a de-westernized perspective. Our discussion today will shed light on the pivotal contributions of three exiled journalists from Afghanistan, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, countries characterized by autocratic and authoritarian-style systems of governance. In the next hour, we will discuss several aspects of the issue, from resilience of these journalists who, despite facing exile, find innovative ways to continue their work, cross-border collaborative platforms that empower journalists in exile to pursue their journalistic endeavors while ensuring their safety, of course, and the limitations these exiled journalists face in covering issues that are unreported or underreported in their homeland. With me today is Bilal Savri. He is an Afghan journalist who fled Afghanistan in August 2021. A veteran journalist, Savri has reported from Afghanistan for 2 decades for several international media organizations, including BBC, BBC News, ABC News, TRT World, RT News, Al Jazeera English, CNN, and Radio New Zealand, among others. He's also worked as a researcher for multiple non-for-profit organizations and has served as the lead researcher with Gretchen Peters for her book, Seeds of Terror, How Heroin is Bankrolling the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Thank you so much for joining us, Bilal. We have Safa with us. Safa Al-Ahmed is a Saudi journalist and filmmaker. She has directed documentaries for PBS and the BBC, focusing on the Middle East, including Saudi Secret Uprising, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and Yemen Under Siege. Her work on Yemen spans a decade and reflects the bloody trajectory of the conflicts within the country and their international impact. She is twice Emmy Award winner of the 2015 Index on Censorship Freedom of Expression Award for Journalism, the El Mundo Award for Journalism, the 2015 Canadian Journalist for Free Expression International Press Freedom Award, and Association of International Broadcasting Best International Investigation. Woo, Safa. She's also the recipient of the Wallenberg Medal from the University of Michigan in 2019. Safa has also served as a board member of the Frontline Freelance Register, which advocates for the safety and welfare of freelance journalists who are exposed to risk in their work. Thank you so much for giving us your valuable time today, Safa. And we have with us, and we have with us Taha Siddiqui, is a Pakistani journalist who's living in exile in France since 2018. He founded the Dissident Club, a bar in Paris where dissidents of the world meet. He continues to write in exile for several international news organizations and also teaches media at Sciences Po University in Paris. In Pakistan, he reported for leading international media, including the New York Times, The Guardian, France 24. In 2014, Taha received the Prix Albert Londres for his documentary called The War Against Polio. He fled Pakistan after surviving an assassination and kidnapping attempt allegedly carried out by the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI. Thank you so much. I can already feel the power of words just being in your company. And so we will start with what is the most important when journalists take this decision of leaving or fleeing their country, a place that has given them identity, a place where they have learned, a place where they have learned how to question the status quo. Safa, I will like to start with you. If you could tell us, how did you come to be in exile and what challenges did you face when you were leaving your home country?
Oof. So I made a documentary called Saudi Secret Uprising, and it took about a year to do it. And as with everything with these governments, you never know how far they're going to take things, and how angry or not angry they're going to be about a certain body of journalism. But after the film came out in the BBC in 2014, the reaction was really angry by the government and the usual trolling and all of that. But then they also sent an official letter from the Saudi embassy in London to the BBC, naming all my alleged crimes as a Saudi citizen. So to me, the alleged crimes of journalism, basically. And comparing me to some white journalists who, look, they came into Saudi Arabia and they behaved so well. And, nobody stopped them from covering. And it's just to go directly into your comment on how different we're seen in the global South, right? And the white gaze on what is an important story in our regions, right? And they're so oblivious to what are the power dynamics of me doing a story on Saudi versus a white guy coming in and doing a story on Saudi. And so clearly after that, I felt it was no longer safe to go back into Saudi, considering that many of the people in the film are either killed, disappeared, or in exile themselves. And I've been named in some of the court cases of some of the people that that appeared in my documentary, and one of them is awaiting execution as well as we speak. And so by exile, I'm sure Bilal feels the same way. It's not like or even it's not about, you don't need to be directly threatened. Like they are so in control. You know what the modus operandi of the government is. And so I am sure the government would say Safa is free to come back to Saudi Arabia whenever she wants. But the question is not, will I be able to come back into Saudi? It's, will I be able to leave Saudi? And we've seen how they've reacted to many of the feminists working inside Saudi Arabia, of them trying to organize. They've been disappeared, put on trial for terrorism. So all the language that the West has used against us, now our governments are using against us as well to silence us. And journalism, there's no independent journalism in Saudi at all, period. And so there was no way of covering Saudi and covering the stuff the government doesn't want to talk about without it being undercover. And so it was really dishonest of the government to claim that, I could have gotten permissions and they would have let me do the stories freely. So it's a bit of a farce, really.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That sounds like a lot. And you mentioned journalistic independence, and you mentioned that you may be able to go back, but it will be difficult to see either you're able to do your work or get out of the country again. Which takes me to Bilal, because we know that the Taliban are a de facto government, and we know that they're a militant terrorist organization. So Bilal, I would just following up on what Safa mentioned about journalistic independence. How has living in exile affected your ability to maintain journalistic independence, especially when you're reporting on events from your country?
Thank you very much for having me. I totally agree with Safa that not only are we not able to go back to our country of origin, Afghanistan, but there's no space for people like myself. That is why I was forced to leave in the first place. And we do get to notice that the Taliban are protecting their own narrative, basically. There's a Taliban narrative today, and they're basically associating everyone that was, I apologize, these are my daughters that are awake quite early today. So that is why we're not able to simply be in Afghanistan and report on critical issues. For example, the Taliban's ban on girls not being able to go to school, not being able to work, not being able to basically be visible in the public, right? The fact that the Taliban have banned music for example, in all forms of entertainment. So the critical question is, how do we continue working on Afghanistan from places like Canada, which is now my second home? And it's never easy because we're far away from the country. We don't have the same level of access, and it is really a painful reality. But at the same time, we do live in an era where we have access to WhatsApp, Telegram, and all forms of technology, and we make good use of that. Having said that, people who are in contact with us have been jailed. People who are in contact with us have been threatened. People who are advocating for girls' education, like Matiola Wisa, or inside Taliban jails. And the painful reality is that the West and many of the countries in the international community are basically accepting the Taliban as the new sort of normal. So they were okay with the corruption. They were okay with a lot of the bad elements of the last 20 years during the US invasion. But today they're saying this is fine. This is Afghan good enough sort of situation, and this selectiveness and tolerating dictatorships and military regimes and so on and so forth is sort of the new law for all of us. But at the same time, many Afghans, including myself, are continuing on not giving up on the country. Citizen journalism is really picking up. And to be honest with you, I don't have any high hopes that I'll be able to go back to the country. It's just not me going back to Afghanistan, but it's myself not being able to have the space. And most of our colleagues in Tolo News and other organizations have been jailed. Taliban, soldiers and Taliban's intelligence service and their sort of morality police, if I can call them that, have barged into newsrooms. They have jailed many of our colleagues, and you don't see our female colleagues continuing their work at all. So that's sort of the reality for us. But then there's some critical work that some of our colleagues like myself are doing. For example, the use of children and the opium production in the South, the fact that children are now working in the methamphetamine sort of production labs that are, on the rise, the fact that the Taliban are turning Afghanistan into, a large sort of center for madrasas. I call it the madrasization of Afghanistan, where young suicide attackers are basically being groomed. So these are all critical issues that we try to cover it as much as we can.
Oh, thank you. You're talking about covering issues. That brings me to a question about professional networks. Taha, I will come to you. I know because of the friendship history that we share and the professional background, that you had a very vast professional network in Pakistan of journalists and other. So how challenging is it to maintain that professional network and relationships with fellow journalists and sources from your home country while you're in exile?
Thank you first of all for having me for this webinar, which is really important. To begin with, I mean, I would continue what Bilal was saying, basically, because in the in the time of technology that we are living in, with WhatsApp, Telegram, or Signal, it's much easier to contact people on the ground and have this sort of strong relationships or strong connections. When I left in 2018, I had already had over 12, 13 years of networking with the local journalists. And as I was working with international media, I was traveling around the country. So I had been hiring local journalists to work with me on the work that I was doing. So I had a very strong network in that sense, which of people that I'm personally in contact with even today. And when I went into exile, many of them actually since then have been reaching out every now and then, telling me that these are the stories that we cannot cover here. Can you tweet about it? Can you post it on social media? Can you write about it? Or these are the sources. I mean, even just before this conversation, like I got a message today earlier on about some, killing in Pakistan, which has been like a kill and dump policy that we have of, so there are threats to local journalists over there. And because of the network that I have enjoyed in the past, that I've created and I've established, I've been able to sort of keep that connection going on. But at the same time, there is the other aspect of it, of whether or not people want to keep in touch with someone like me. Because I am persona non grata in many ways in the country. I am considered a traitor or whatever they want to call me. But basically, I mean, that reminds me of one incident like that. I have a very close friend of mine who works with international media, and we were in touch on regularly on WhatsApp. And one day he basically blocked me from WhatsApp, and I couldn't, I couldn't understand what was going on. I couldn't get in touch with him, and then he messaged me from Signal, from another number, saying that please do not message me ever again on WhatsApp. And I was like, what's happening? And then I spoke to him, and he said that his boss, his editor in chief at his news organization, called him in and said that he had received a message or a phone call or whatever, like from the intelligence agencies, from the ISI, stating that this particular journalist was in touch with Taha Siddiqui, who's abroad in exile, and is feeding him information from Pakistan. And we are monitoring that conversation, and he's going to get into trouble, and your organization is going to get into trouble. So tell your employee to stop talking to Taha if he wants to, remain safe. So this was a direct threat. So there have been those aspects of where journalists have been told not to directly interact with me because the ISI was watching them, or somehow or the other, because there's a lot of monitoring that goes on in Pakistan, off phone calls, off your communications. Then there's another aspect of it, which is basically whether or not journalists, prominent journalists specifically, want to be associated with you. So I have two other examples of that, in which journalists from Pakistan were visiting Paris, and they are good friends of mine. They visited me. We had a chat and everything, and then when we started, it was basically talking about Pakistan, etc. And at the end of it, it's just there's this sort of trend of like taking a photo together and saying that, okay, we'll post this photo on social media. Both of those journalists, one of them is very prominent. She's a prominent television anchor. Don't want to name her, but the other one is Murtaza Solangi, who I would like to name because he is now the information minister. And both of them told me that they would not like to have a picture taken with me and post it on social media. So we're okay with taking that picture, but do not post it on social media, which basically made me feel a little bit. I was hurt, to begin with, because I felt like these were my friends, and these are my connections, or these are my connections to Pakistan, or this is my professional network, and this is the way they're behaving with me. And they should. I mean, I'm not asking for anything more, just solidarity through photos or something like that. And yet I couldn't. And so I understand. I mean, people who are on ground, they have their own compromises to make. They have their own ways to sort of deal with oppressive regimes like that of Pakistan. But I mean, I think the bigger the name is, or the bigger the organization the journalists work for, the more that they have to protect themselves in Pakistan and countries like that, because they are much more under observation. Smaller journalists, local journalists, I still have a very good relationship with them. I even built a website called safenewsrooms.org, which was for about South Asians for freedom of expression, which was banned in Pakistan. So I had to start another website. And the idea was that this website will give space to censored stories from Pakistan. And as soon as I opened this, it was like floodgates, so many people contact me saying, can you cover this? And I mean, there's not just the issues of, covering the security or the state, the security state of Pakistan, for example, like, the military issues, affairs, but issues like religion, for example, for blasphemy. Those are topics that cannot be covered in Pakistan. So there are these several taboo topics that you cannot cover in Pakistan. And once you go into exile, I think you have a better sort of you have much better protection of being able to talk about them. And I think we need to sort of look at that sort of that balance between whether you're on ground and your personal safety is at risk, or you're at distance, and then you can talk about these things, and you give up a little bit of, like, as it was mentioned earlier, that you give up some access to with yourself directly, but at the same time, with the kind of tools we have, with the technology we have today, I think that overcomes these obstacles.
So is the website that you had to that was censored or banned in Pakistan, Safe Newsrooms, is it on the same name, the new one that you made, or is it with a different name?
No, now it's called southasiapress.org, and we try to sort of, like, document Pakistani stories on that. I have received several messages from the Pakistan Telecom Authority over my posts saying that they violate Pakistani laws, but as of yet, Twitter or Facebook have not taken any action. So I'm glad about that. But I mean, there's still this pressure that continues to go on.
You talk about observing or monitoring journalists and surveillance, basically. That falls directly into the next question, where we also move into the second section of this session, which is about impact. Where, Safa, I can probably start with you, and then we can see if Bilal and Taha has something to add to this, about leveraging your unique position, being in exile, to cover stories from your home country, which, as Taha mentioned, local journalists do not have the privilege or the freedom to cover many such probably taboo stories or other issues that the authoritarian systems do not want you to. So I would just like to ask, in what ways have you used or leveraged your position as an exiled journalist to shed light on issues in your home country which have otherwise not received international attention?
So my position is a bit different than Taha. I'm happy that he's so optimistic about his positionality in exile. I think because I'm a filmmaker, and so print is a lot easier in being in exile and publishing stories. But for me as a filmmaker, I think Saudi is a lot worse than Afghanistan and Pakistan, oddly to say, when it comes to freedom of the press, right? And so it's not even about finding good local journalists that want to give you information, because there aren't any, because there's no culture of independent journalism in Saudi. But two, even if the journalists wanted the story done, right, and they're going to give it, they can't, because there's no way within Saudi Arabia to publish any of these things. Like, I follow Afghanistan and Pakistan very closely, and I'm shocked about what is actually published. I mean, obviously before the Taliban, but I am shocked about the stuff that people are still able to publish and move around in both countries. And so the ceiling is up than in Saudi Arabia. And even for Western journalists who come into the country, there's yet been any journalist that actually has done proper journalism, investigative journalism inside Saudi Arabia. They cover all the usual suspects. They cover all the usual stories. The Saudi people are invisible. The most important thing is their obsession with the crown prince, as if there is nothing else besides the crown prince. If you look at the majority of the stories that come out of Saudi, it's this obsession with royalty, right? With the monarchy. There is nothing else that's more significant than that. And so there is a lot of pushback from my perspective, even before I lived in exile, of interest in stories that are not interesting to the white gaze. And so it's either the white commissioners find something interesting in Saudi, which I don't usually find interesting, because it fits within their stereotypes of what the country is dealing with, right? And so it's either the royal family, or until a few years ago, their obsession with the ban on women driving in Saudi. Within the context, for me, of everything, all the shit that's happening inside Saudi Arabia, that's not one of them, right? The symbolism of it is an issue, but there's so many deeper issues in the country that they don't want to deal with because it doesn't fit into the stereotype. Like even the film I did about the uprising in the Eastern Province in 2011, among the other Arab countries' uprisings, it took me over a year to find somebody that would commission it because it was not the narrative that they were interested in. Right? Saudis don't, they're rich and comfortable, and they're not involved in politics. They're not politically mature. It's only the other countries that have this, and Saudi government is anti-revolutionary, right? And that's the only interesting thing for them. They don't want to hear anything from the ground itself. So exile or no exile, it's still very difficult to get good, interesting, on-the-ground investigations going. And you don't have the ability, in talking about contacts, it is an anti-terrorism crime in Saudi to communicate with people that the government deems critical of the state, right? And so contacting me is a crime. Contacting anyone who is from the Saudi exile who is critical of Saudi is also a crime. And they can deny it all they want. It's in the laws, and they have mentioned it as crimes when they interrogate people inside Saudi, right? And so this all makes it on all the levels for me. One, the duty of care as a journalist for me towards the people that communicate with me gets really complicated because one, if anybody finds out, that is immediately against the law, right? Two, digital security is a massive issue for me because the Saudi government has paid millions on programs like Pegasus, zero-click hacks, all of that to monitor people inside Saudi Arabia and abroad, right? Like with Jamal Khashoggi and his family members. And so there is a real risk there that I have trouble managing, especially as a freelancer, of like, if somebody's going to give me information, I have a responsibility to make sure that they are safe and that they're aware of those dangers, right? And so that means stories take a lot longer to develop because it takes a lot longer to verify. I'm not on the ground, so I'm no longer able to do proper documentaries the way I would like to make them. And I have a hard time commissioning others to do so on the ground because of the duty of care of that as well. And so there's so many things now that I am no longer able to do things the way I would think is the proper way of investigating and making documentaries in a way that is responsible and accurate, right? And so the accuracy is another problem. Even when I was inside Saudi, it was hard to get accurate information. Neither did the government, and I'm sure in Pakistan, Afghanistan, same thing. They never give you accurate statistics. You never know what the real numbers are. And even if you're on the ground, you still have a problem with that, right? And so this is an added burden in exile of, are you sure what somebody's telling you is accurate? Because I also worry about, is the government feeding specific information to us? So then if we go public with it, then they're like, oh no, but this is not true. How did they verify that? And then we would be, we would lose credibility, right? Because we said something that wasn't true. And that is the case with some human rights organizations that said, like, for example, Qatari human rights activist was murdered in Qatar and she wasn't murdered, and everybody went. And so there's so many difficulties in the Gulf specifically, but and I will refer specifically to Saudi, and how journalism doesn't really exist in any way. So then there is no network to feed into of other journalists. Like, I'm very jealous of the setup that Afghanistan and Pakistan have in that way, because you already have a system in place. You have more maneuverability, even with all the shit that's happening right now, of you have trained journalists on the ground who know how to do things, and they will have the courage to go out to reach out to others outside. It's like, this is going on, please get it. Yeah? What we have is not that. We have citizens that reach out and tell you X, Y, and Z is happening, right? And that is more difficult. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be covering them, but the verification process is so much more difficult. And that adds, it gets really complicated in that way. So I've been trying to do a follow-up documentary for a while now. And one, there's no interest from the West in commissioning a story on Saudi that's not about MBS. And the other one is, how do I manage the security issues? And that's a massive one for me personally. And so it's been really slow in that way. And so when you say, have I been able to be a platform? I honestly don't think I have, in the way that Taha has referred to. I was briefly the director of a human rights organization, specifically on Saudi in London, for example. And I will do things that way. But for me, on a journalistic level, which is bigger than exile, not exile, for me, social media is not my platform for long form journalism. All right, it's a great distribution marketing element, but it is not journalism. It cannot be the beginning and the end of a story, because that is too shallow, especially when you're trying to deal with things that are very complex. And it's not safe for me to be constantly on social media for all the various digital security reasons that we talked about, right? And so that's not how I operate, right? For other people, I think it works really well and stuff, but we need, as journalists, to move on from Twitter/X, whatever they want to call it, or Instagram, like we can see now with Palestine. The silencing across the board of digital social media platforms, of pulling down accounts, of pulling down stories and videos. And so there needs to be other ways. We need to work on better ways to have
more sustainable ways.
More sustainable, but also more space, right? And so then you can say something more meaningful on it. For me, social media is draining. It's not accurate. It's a quicker way to get a hit on a story, right? But then you get the illusion of knowing a story, but you haven't really delved into it. And so to me, this is a bigger issue that is an existential one to me of like, how do you exist as a journalist in general? And I think with the challenge of social media, you know?
I think the entire attention economies of the audience also plays a big role there. You mentioned the white gaze multiple times and the stereotypes, and I completely agree, especially when I look at reporting on Afghanistan or from Afghanistan. And Bilal, you would have guessed that I want to now direct my question towards you. Most of the coverage that I've been looking at as a researcher over the last couple of years, especially after August 2021, is about girls' education and the ban on women related to women, and also the heroin trade, which again goes back to what Safa was talking about, the stories that the West are more interested in, the way they have framed these places, and they don't want to break that frame, because these are the only kind of stories that people want to work on or are coming out from those regions. So Bilal, my question to you would be, what do you think are, apart from women's issues and other issues that are now being tackled with in international media, what are some of the issues that you think are alarmingly underreported from Afghanistan and need attention, journalistic attention, whether it's for whatever capacity local journalists can do under an authoritarian regime or journalists in exile? So I would like to hear that.
Thank you very much. I mean, let's take the example of the deadly and devastating earthquake recently in Herat province on the border with Iran, and in many other Western provinces. We have, according to several reliable estimates by the UN and colleagues on the ground, more than 3,000 Afghans were killed. Most of them were children, and thousands of others were wounded, and people were displaced. Massive economic losses at a village district level in Herat province, which is the home of Afghan grapes and saffron and carpets and so on and so forth. But I did not see any international coverage, obviously because of the tragedy that was happening in the Middle East, the sort of horrifying situation first the Hamas attack against the Israeli civilians, and then later on the indiscriminate attacks in Gaza. That's totally understandable. But I think we live in an era where media coverage is very selective. And, I go back to this sort of loss of moral high ground. It's just not in one or two areas. I think we do discriminate, quite visibly. We say this story is important and that story is not important. These children are more worthy, those children are not more worthy. And I think what that makes me feel as an Afghan, since I was forced to leave my country, and I feel the pain of my colleagues from Saudi and Pakistan, is the idea that where do we move on with our professional lives when there's lack of interest, in our countries and our people's stories. And to be honest with you, I see the situation as such where I have to arrange Twitter spaces. Many Afghans have to arrange Twitter spaces because this is the only way we can discuss critical issues. And people inside Afghanistan really can speak on such platforms because they're too scared. They'll be jailed, they will be haunted. And for us in Afghanistan, the story is not about one issue or another issue. It's about a diverse set of challenges. The fact that the Taliban today have 17,500 prisoners, most of them are former members of the Afghan National Security Forces. The fact that there's torture, the fact that the Taliban continue to deny the Afghan girls their rights to go and educate themselves. The fact that girls who should have been in classrooms are now working in carpet weaving and carpet weaving factories, and they're losing their eyesight because they're working in carpet weaving. And it's actually documented that a lot of these girls have serious eye problems. For example, boys are either going to madrasas where they're being taught how to become the next generation of suicide attackers, how to hate everyone, including Afghans in the outside world, or they work in methamphetamine sort of, uh, processing labs. The idea that there's high crime rate, Kandahar and other capitals where we see murders and theft and robbery, right? So, I mean, having said all of that, I also understand that we don't get paid for our work as well. And we only do it as sort of our attachment back to our homeland. And we feel that this is sort of the time to pay back. But to be honest with you, this is just not sustainable in the long run. And this is not also practical. So part of me is lost in this life in exile, but part of me is still motivated by what activists and the networks of contacts and our colleagues and others are feeding us the information. And I agree wholeheartedly with my colleague Safa that it is never easy, even though I've just left Afghanistan 2 years ago, even though I have a vast network. I was with the BBC, I was with other international organizations, but it is never and ever easy to report at an age where disinformation is very prevalent, where we have been misled not only by the Taliban but also by non-Taliban sort of insurgent groups. And it's kind of the irony in Afghanistan because these were allies of the West until 2 years ago, and today there is an insurgency. Yes, it's a small scale insurgency, but it is growing. It has the potential, and overall, I mean, I see that the Taliban are making the mistakes that the Republic made, which is that they are ruling with an iron fist since they have been taking over as the de facto authorities. They're cracking down against Afghan people. They're cracking down against the Afghan women. And more importantly, the more people they jail, the more people they kill, especially from the non-Pashtun ethnic groups, the more they sow the seeds of hatred, and they're opening another sort of war. I would also like to quickly mention another sort of challenging area and that's the issue of Pakistani Taliban operating from Afghan soil, while we were in touch with the Pakistani Taliban, just like we were in touch with all the other groups. Some of that recent coverage where I documented or I tweeted or I named villages saying that Afghan Taliban are now fighting inside Pakistan, and here are their coffins, here are the graves. Some people in Afghanistan basically labeled me quite quickly as an unpatriotic Afghan because I was revealing state secrets. And our understanding of the situation is that we only and only remain committed to telling the story, just like we were exposing Pakistan's sort of destructive role in terms of propping up the insurgency. I mean, the Pakistani military and intelligence, we will continue to hold the Taliban accountable. But I mean, this is easier said than done. And the most critical, I think, aspect of this mission that we want to be part of it, I mean, we were there for 20 years, is the fact that now there is, a very homegrown, deeply rooted movement of Afghan women who are inside the country, uh, just suddenly propping up, younger Afghan women who are actually braver than most of us, than, all of us actually. They are putting up a fight and they're saying, look, we want simple things. We want the ability to work, to live, to have our freedom for education. And I think it is sort of commendable, to see that aspect of it. We also continue to raise awareness. And I feel this is my job as a global sort of citizen, as someone who's worked only in Afghanistan, but with an international perspective, that we continue to tell the world that Afghanistan is becoming a hub for international terrorism, just like it was in the 90s. And I feel like, Afghanistan will make a comeback in terms of its problems on the doorsteps of, Europe, the neighborhood, from the drugs to the refugees to militancy, to international terrorism.
Yeah.
And I also have a feeling that the big problem that I've started noticing, and I call it sort of the cyber tribalism, that is the idea of intolerance in this toxic environment on the Afghan social media landscape, where people are ganging up against you if you express a certain view. And that very well also includes some of us in the exile community or in the diaspora. If someone visits Afghanistan, we very soon label that person as a Taliban sympathizer. And
Uh,
and funny enough, for us who are living in the West, we've been labeled many different names. So it's not an easy environment. And I
yeah.
hope that I answered that question.
Yeah, no,
That
definitely.
you wanted.
Can
No,
I
definitely.
just add? Can I add to Bilal's point,
Please, please.
Aisha? I think it's really important. I think at least this is what I heard from Bilal, and this is what I struggle with as well. Is that there are two levels of how media covers the region, right? There's the hyper local and the hyper global, right? And there's nowhere in between. So when we're talking about these stories that have regional significance, right, but don't come up to the interest of, oh, does America and the White House give a shit about this or not, right? And only when things like what Bilal was mourning, it's like when it truly blows up in their faces, then they scramble. It's like, oh my God, how did we get here? Right? Tell us everything. And so they try to play catch up because they haven't been paying attention, because it was like a slow boil infestation. And so it wasn't big enough and it wasn't bad enough for them to pay attention to. And we live in that place in the in between, right? Where we're not hyper local, as Bilal was saying. It's like we worked for international organizations when we weren't working for local, and the same with Taha. And so we can see the both, right? And so we can see the trends before they get to the point where they're explosive, and then everybody is paying attention to. But we don't have neither the support, the platforms, the commissions, the funding, the support to do those stories before they become that, right? Yeah. And that's the struggle, at least for me, of like, there's so many really important stories that need to be done with resources and properly between those two. And so the hyper-local stuff can be covered easier because they're not as threatening to the local governments, right, on that level. But when it comes to more complicated, more dangerous investigative stories, there's no room for it on the international level because the white gaze doesn't give a shit about it yet, right? Because no white people have been killed or in danger or their interests are in danger. And so we remain invisible in that in-between world as journalists in exile, because we are not the ones on the ground, but neither are we trying to tell a story that they care about, right? And so and this is the struggle for me of how do we get that nuance, that context, those stories that you won't find in the New York Times or the Guardian, because that's a whole different level of a white gaze than where we are at. And that there is no, I have no answer for this right now, because I've been struggling with finding that space where we can do that. And I know you're talking about collaborations, and we're all, the three of us are all struggling to find proper support, grants, platforms that can sustain us because we live in exile, but also sustain us properly as journalists, so we can continue doing our journalism, right? No matter what that transformation is. But that now, as far as I know, does not exist for anybody I know. We're all struggling. We're trying to patch things up in our lives in other ways, because the journalism itself that got us into exile is no longer something that is sustainable, that they give a shit about, right? The organizations, the international organizations that we did these stories for, that's not an issue for them. That is not something that they're interested in to pursue. Oh, khalas, we're done. We did that story, now it's been 10 years. So now we moved on to something else. Now they're moving on to Palestine, Gaza, but then it will be something else. They don't care about Afghanistan. I was like, who I still can't believe what's happening in Afghanistan. I'm in shock of the audacity of the United States, of how they covered their own fucking failure, but now they're getting involved in another place. It's mind-blowing to me that their own media, that they shame us that we don't have independent media, we don't have good journalism, but they're not calling out their own government on this shit, and they're continuing to get involved in it. And so I think it's a general crisis of journalism, and not just us journalists in exile.
But overall, the independence of journalism, definitely. Taha was mentioning how he is labeled as the traitor, or as Bilal was mentioning that maybe journalists in exile are not patriotic enough, and I understand that this is another set of challenges that journalists in exile face, of being I won't say losing credibility, but just being questioned of why are you are out there, So Taha, I would like to ask you, do you know about what do you know, or how do you think international organizations and the international media can help or create a platform these journalists in exile? I know that Safa said that there isn't enough, but what can be done to at least, I know that you have your website and that initiative and different, and Bilal also mentioned citizen journalism, but what else can help to create the sustainable model for journalists in exile?
Well, when I was going into exile, I remember a very good journalist friend of mine told me that you're going to go into exile, and continuing with what was being discussed earlier here, he said that, you're going to go into oblivion and nobody's going to remember you because, your work is here in Pakistan and this is where you are from. And if you go into exile and you leave, that's it, it'll be the end of the day. But I think, over the last 5-6 years that I've been in exile, I've tried to reinvent myself in many different ways to sort of continue, having that relevance in Pakistan with my voice, and I've done it in different ways. In for example, as Safa was mentioning with, video journalism, that's what I used to do. I used to do investigative documentary work for international media also. And I can't do that anymore. So I reinvented myself to focus more on print, perhaps, and sort of look at at that aspect of journalism. Also, the fact that my website got banned, or the last information minister, not the current one, but the previous one in Imran Khan's government, mentioned me on TV saying that what am I doing in exile, etc., shows that I am impacting back home. Like they're still monitoring, or still seeing what I'm doing. And that for me gives me this sort of credibility, or sort of this assurance that okay, I'm doing something impactful. That's why it is bothering them. But I mean, one of the things that I have faced and everybody was talking about is how to have those, financial resources while balancing your life in exile. Because once you go into exile, you suddenly do not have a home. You suddenly do not have those networks. You don't have the same sort of friends, the same kind of, family around you. So you're on your own, and when that happens, you question whether or not you want to continue this sort of, path of so-called destroying yourself, as people might perceive it, like self-destructive, because you want to have a living, and you want to continue having a sustainability. And even if you have your own family to support in exile, like I do, that's also very difficult. So when I came here in exile at that point in time, I was like, okay, should I continue with talking about Pakistan, or should I just move on and continue talking about something else? And a lot of people did mention to me that, you've worked on Pakistan, but you've also reported from Afghanistan and from the South Asian region. So you can, you're a journalist, you can start reporting on something else. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to focus on Pakistan because I went into exile because I couldn't tell the story of Pakistan. So I wanted to continue on that, but that was not sustainable. So I reached out to different sort of, these organizations which provide you with grants, which provide you with some kind of funds so that you could continue your work. And I would say that I was really disappointed because most of these news organizations, or most of these development organizations, or media development organizations, they have these rigid sort of non-flexible rules that you have to be based in the country, for example. I mean, if I was based in the country, then I wouldn't need your support to begin with, right? I need your support because I'm not based in the country, and I can't be based in the country. They're like, okay, at least have a registered company in the country. I'm like, okay, I tried that. Nobody wants to register a company with me. I mean, I'm not there anymore. So all of these difficulties of finding, the right kind of funding became a big problem. So then, we have other options now because of the way, again, how can we use social media to our benefit? There is crowdfunding, for example. Those are methods that, you find people to fund your activities that you want to do. You want to, there are organizations that are doing it very successfully. And I've also done it for the Dissident Club, for example, and try to raise funds so as to support myself by appealing to people in that way. So I think there is a big lack of support when it comes to exiled journalists, where because people say that, okay, now that you've gone into exile, now just move on and can do something with your life which is not connected to your past, because now you have a new life. But I didn't choose to have this new life. I wanted to continue my life in Pakistan, and yet I could not. So I went into exile to continue doing the kind of work I was doing. So I want to continue that. And it is difficult, but I mean, there are some examples that I've seen in France, for example. There's one example that was pretty interesting. That is called there's a local initiative called the Giti News, which I has covered me, and I worked with them briefly. Also, they basically what they do is they pair up a French journalist with a refugee journalist, and both of them together work on stories, local stories, or French stories, or international stories, or I mean, most of the time they cover migration stories. And that's one initiative that I've seen that really brings up this partnership between the West and the global South and the global North in that sense. Another initiative that I saw, which is also run by someone that I know, is from Belgium, in Brussels. It's called Engage. which is basically about exiled journalists. And again, they have a lot of exiled journalists working for them. It's a very small initiative, but again, it's something that is focusing on exiled journalists, bringing them together, and saying that okay, let's work with exiled journalists, and again, the stories that they cover are of stories of migration, stories about which is what most of the time we were focusing on because we've gone through the whole process, perhaps. So it's for our understanding, it's better. So there are a few, but they're very few and very little of these kind of
But they
initiatives.
pigeonhole you as well as a journalist, right? Like
Sorry.
they pigeonhole you as well. It's like
Yes,
they're there,
as
exiled journalists. This is the kind of
yeah,
story
exactly.
you
So
can
this is
do,
the kind of
right? We have to
the
pair you with an actual French journalist to do a story. Like that's so demeaning. And any of those projects are such little money, if any, right? Like it's just like, oh, you should be grateful because we're a tiny little organization and we're not doing like the maximum I got was like a fellowship that's basically attending a conference on exiled journalists. I was like, what the hell is this? Like it's lip service so then they can feel better about themselves, like they're doing something about journalism. But in the end, we're being pigeonholed as like, this is the only story you can do. As Taha and Bilal were saying, they've worked everywhere. Yeah, they're capable of working in a lot of places, but these organizations only feel comfortable pigeonholing you into one thing. Sorry, I took over.
I mean, yeah, and no, and exactly, Safa. Actually, I mean that reminds me of when I came to France, and I came here, and I was the correspondent for France 24. So I went and met with the management of France 24, telling them that I'm here now, and I can perhaps work on the English desk or something like that. And the management's response at that time was that they were like, first of all, when you were not just working for us, so why are you our responsibility? And this was very shocking for me to hear that. And I was like, yeah, but I worked for you for 6 years, 7 years. And they're like, yeah, but you were a correspondent for us, but you were also writing for the New York Times. You were also reporting for them and this and that. So how do you know that it's ours? Why should we take the responsibility of providing you with sustenance or with jobs, etc.? Then there was this whole issue of language barrier, and they said, oh, but you don't speak French. So I was like, yeah, but English, you have an English channel. So there was a lot of back and forth in that. And then, I mean, at the same time, they were also, I mean, I was shocked. They said to me, because before I had to leave into exile, I had a case against me in 2017, and in 2017, France 24, which was, I was a correspondent for it, advised me internally to calm myself down and to sort of like, try to compromise and continue reporting in the country. And they were like, last year we told you not to do this, and look what has it gotten to you? You've like left. So they were like, there was a lot of victim blaming, and I was shocked because this is an organization that I was associated with for 6 years. And not just that, when you mentioned the prize that I'd gotten, the Prix Albert Londres, into 2014, they had highlighted that all over their websites and their news bulletins, etc., that, oh, our journalists got this. When I got attacked, they were refusing to do a story saying that, oh, we don't want to get into trouble because we have to keep a relationship. Recently, when my book came out earlier this year, the graphic novel that I published, I went to different medias for partnerships. And when I went to France 24, again, they told me the same thing. They're like, we do not want to sort of jeopardize our relationship and our journalists in Pakistan, and how it will be perceived that we are partnering with an exiled journalist like you. So, I mean, multiple times, you face with these big organizations who have the capacity to support you, to be, and who you worked with and put your life at risk for. They do not come forward once you need it. And another thing, I think we haven't mentioned that, but I think Safa briefly mentioned that, is that the transnational repression that we're seeing nowadays on journalists in exile. Jamal Khashoggi is the most famous case in recent times, but we've seen repeatedly. I've seen journalists. Bloggers, etc. Like, for example, there was the case of Akas Guraya who's a Pakistani blogger in Netherlands, who had an assassin, who after him, who was being, handled from Pakistan. And there was an assassin that was supposed to kill him, but was caught just in time. We've seen other dissidents in exile, showing up dead. I have myself, when I arrived here, and then multiple times over the last few years, have received intelligence assessment from the French intelligence, from the American intelligence, telling me that, my name is on a kill list, so I should be careful. I should be very careful in who do I talk to. Then my parents back home have also been threatened. My sisters, in-laws have been threatened. So there's been all these sort of transnational repressions that you also face. So while you're trying to find funds and sustainability, while you're trying to sort of like rebuild your life in exile, while you're trying to sort of like, keep your relationships in Pakistan, at the same time, you have all these threats and these intimidations. So this is a lot to manage, but yet
Yes.
we continue. Yet we continue.
No, I understand this repression, as you mentioned, is happening both on professional and personal levels as well, and can be very distressing. And
but
of course,
it's racism as well, because like what he's talking about with France 24, they talk about the freedom of press in Europe because they deserve it, but we don't. We should be so lucky as to be hired by them, and then we need to shut the fuck up afterwards because now you've crossed the line with the government, and they don't want to support you in that because they don't care about freedom of the press in Pakistan or in Saudi or in Afghanistan, right? We're just lucky to survive. And I'm sure I've heard this so much as a rhetoric in Afghanistan, and Bilal has been mentioning this, where it's like, oh, now the Taliban are suddenly good enough to run the country, right? The terrorists are now good enough. 20 years later, full circle, as if all the people who died for absolutely nothing, everything's back to normal because that's good for them. And so we have to also fight and be very aware of this kind of rhetoric against us. This the victim blaming, the gaslighting. It's like you're the one who did something wrong, right? They don't celebrate us when it's not convenient for them. And that is something that they have to be called out for. I didn't do a story in Saudi because the BBC asked me. I'm the one who feels that these stories need to be done, right? I don't need them to do me a favor, right? I don't think any of us need media to do us a favor by hiring us for stuff. Like let us do our jobs, and you have to respect your responsibility towards us. It's not a favor.
No, we can see the repercussions, and as you mentioned earlier about freelance journalists, that's another black hole of how freelance journalists are treated. Bilal, I would we're almost towards the end of our session, but cross-border collaborations are a topic of utmost interest to me, specifically these days, and especially when it comes to journalism and exile. I mean, we know that the Panama Papers of 2016, that reporting wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have cross-border journalism happening. Bilal, I want to ask you if there is any if you engage, and how do you engage in cross-border journalism on Afghanistan, and are there any cross-border collaborations among journalists happening in Pakistan and Afghanistan? We understand that a lot of Afghan journalists over the last couple of years, some of them I personally know have sought refuge in Pakistan. So is there any sort of collaboration that's happening on a journalistic level?
Well, I mean, look, here's the thing. Because having been a refugee in Pakistan, thankfully, I learned the language of Urdu. And I remember over the last 5-6 years, I was heavily reporting for Pakistani media outlets in Urdu, the TVs, and I was tweeting in Urdu. And people inside Afghanistan were not okay with that. I mean, some of my friends even said, this is not good for your image, on the one hand. On the other hand, they actually did like our critical reporting of Pakistan's involvement in the affairs, I mean, the army and intelligence. And I think one of the biggest tragedies of the last 20 years was that no Pakistani media outlet like Geo TV and others had any sort of effective presence in Afghanistan. And it was kind of vice versa. At least one Afghan TV station was operating outside of Pakistan. And when you look at Afghanistan and Pakistan, politics aside, there's so much that is shared: history, culture, there's economic dependence. There are like millions of refugees living in Pakistan. I think that's sort of one of the biggest failures. And I think I hold people like myself and our colleagues, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan, sort of partly responsible for that. There have been some projects where we have collaborated and worked with our Western colleagues. And I mean, it is a very critical relationship, because there are so many things that they can't do that we can do. But the crux of the problem here is that Afghanistan is not in sort of top of the agenda, as they say. It's not an area of interest anymore. So it's either people going into Afghanistan and making documentaries, which was pretty much, about the last 2 years or so, or there's no coverage. And I mean, I should also point out that the Taliban's media strategy is very visible. First, they cracked down against the Afghan media, and later on, they stopped issuing visas to some Western reporters. I also happen to know that their foreign ministry spokesman, Ahar Balkhi, who's sort of the spin master, a guy who grew up sort of in New Zealand, Afghan New Zealander, he warned some international reporters that if they reported anonymous sources, they have to share them or else they will not be issued a visa. So all of these are contributing to sort of a black hole. You don't get to see anyone writing about Afghanistan anymore, on all of these issues that I mentioned. The only time Afghanistan does get coverage, unfortunately, and it was true even under the Republic, when there would be a big complex attack or there would be a big airstrike. And that was the only time we got on air, pretty much, especially as a freelancer. I can attest to this. So there are areas, there are places where people can collaborate and work. And what we have advocated since we have been forced to leave some of these universities with journalism programs, we've said, use our expertise. Let us share what we know from the field, and let us learn what you can teach us, right? Because there's so many, things that we can learn, but that has not happened. There's sort of failure on that front, and more importantly, there is a human cost. There's a world where these problems are shared. When you talk about Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Afghanistan or any other country anywhere else in the world. So I think that's one area, where journalism can stay alive and should stay alive. And our goal, of our colleagues and myself, in places like Canada, is that we pass on our knowledge to the next generation. There's a very wonderful Afghan woman here. She's running Zan Times, or it's a purely woman-run media organization. She's doing that from Toronto. So there are examples that things can happen, and we're not going to give up on our countries just because we don't live there because of the circumstances, right? I mean, we're from there. We have family. We have an attachment. So we will do our best to do as much as we can when the cameras are there or the cameras are not there.
Yeah. No, you mentioned the founder of Zen Times. I was in one of the workshops with her. So, and it's amazing the kind of work that she's doing, and making sure that those journalists who are reporting to for Zen Times from Afghanistan their identities are kept hidden. So that's great work that she's doing. On that note, when you were talking about collaboration, that you said some collaborations have happened, not necessarily between journalists from Pakistan and Afghanistan, but from journalists from Afghanistan or in Afghanistan with those of the global north. Can you briefly mention any challenges and any opportunities that you must have encountered while doing these collaborative projects?
Well, so look, there was work on, for example, the girls working in carpet weaving factories, Afghan girls, they work on methamphetamine sort of boom before the UN report sort of came out. And the fact that,
Sorry, Bilal, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I said that there was some work that I did with a Western colleague where we helped document how Afghan girls are now having serious eye issues, and there are thousands in a place like Herat because they're now working in carpet weaving factories, or the boom in methamphetamine sort of production across much of South and Southwestern Afghanistan, and the idea that Afghans discovered Ephemeria, the plant that is naturally sort of, grown there. People were using it as a sort of fuel for winter or for everyday cooking. And then suddenly someone came and said, guys, this is Ephemeria, right? Or this is that plant that helps you produce methamphetamine. Or the fact that the Taliban have indeed banned the opium cultivation, but what they have done, they have stocks of it. They have bought it to increase the prices, just like what they did in the years 1990s. So there is some work where people have tapped into our expertise, and we have done it mainly because we see a convergence of interest. It's as simple as that. We want the story to be told. It is perhaps short-term work as well in terms of pay, and I think for years to come, perhaps another 2 3 years, we will still be able, with the current sort of situation, to maintain some sort of an insight into what is happening there. I also happen to know that WhatsApp is not safe, for example, inside Afghanistan. Somehow the Taliban have managed, somehow, I don't know how, to track down people who've been speaking, to myself and our colleagues. And a good example of that is Mathiullah Wesa, the education activist from southern Afghanistan, who has 3,000 or so volunteers, and he was just asking for girls' education, right? So there are, yes, limitations. There are threats to people inside the country. We're all aware of that. But the most important part, I think, that institutions and universities could play is create, fellowships, create, joint sort of ventures. What my friend was saying from Paris, Mr. Siddiqui was saying that I think that can happen. But the sad reality one has to accept is that there's, selectiveness. We don't really matter. Our stories don't matter, and it'll only matter when the Western media outlets, they actually want it. And I mean this with total honesty and humbleness. Having worked with everyone over the last 20 years, that's just the reality. That's how it is.
So what can we do?
I would like to,
Yeah.
Aisha, I would just like to mention something which was being discussed earlier also, which reminded me of another example. And as Safa was saying about pigeonholing us as journalists which can cover migration only. So I remember a couple of years ago this documentary on Pakistan about Islamization of Pakistan, and this whole sort of because this is the obsession of the West also about talking about what's happening with Islam in these Muslim countries, and somehow using that as an example of how Islam is a problem in their own countries, which is not, because this is a different issue. And I remember that I gave this interview in a documentary where they asked me about the issue of how Islam is a problem, etc. And I said, yeah, there's this issue of Islam, but and I clearly mentioned that in France, I do not think that's the same problem, because Islam is not a majority religion here. It has nothing to do with the majority. It's a minority population, and you have your colonial history. You have your foreign policy misadventures in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, etc. And I would not want to be categorized as someone who's bashing on Islam, sitting in the West, because the Western problems with Islam are very different from the problems that we have in our countries.
Yeah.
And when the interview came out, all the parts about me talking about the problems of the Europeans with being Islamophobic was removed. They were completely removed, and only the parts where I was talking about Pakistan and the problem with Islam were kept. So there's also this sort of danger of being used to sort of perpetuate or to propagate these Islamophobic narratives by using people like us, and making us somewhat like a native informant, which we are not. We're not here to do that. We're not here to sort of bash our countries for the pleasure of the West. We're here to critically report on our countries or to talk about them from a critical point of view and to improve them. And that's why many a times I've actually refused giving any interviews to these some of these Western outlets, because I know they have such uh, a heavy far right agenda of Islamophobia that I do not want to be used and by them. So that's something that I think we should also mention, that how journalists in exile sometimes are used for their own setting of narratives, that they already have these preconceived ideas that they already have about Pakistan or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, and then they will find someone who is resonating with that narrative, and then just pick and choose that particular sort of narrative, and the rest of it will be completely edited out. So we have to be careful of that too.
It's like a battle on different fronts every day, and I completely understand, and I acknowledge, and I can relate to all what you have been saying and what Safa and Bilal have been saying about what the West thinks is important and what the West, thinks is something we can ignore at this point, because they're more. I mean, we saw the kind of biased coverage that was coming out after the Russia-Ukraine war started, and how journalists were relating to Ukrainian people Ukrainians who were fleeing, mostly within Europe. So that was, as someone coming from a country in the global South, it really impacts me, not only as a researcher or a former journalist, but on a personal level as well. It's like having to fight every day to explain why we exist and why these things matter. And I know that sometimes I personally find that it's just exhausting, but then it needs to be done.
Suddenly
So
you realize that they know how to humanize people,
yeah.
right? Like, oh, we didn't need to tell you that we're humans and we deserve to live. You already knew how to do this. We can see you doing it, and it's just like the gaslighting of journalistic institutions on what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in your journalism, when all of a sudden you watch them completely negate all of it, right, in their coverage, because they're not even pretending that they're being critical of the Ukrainian sources, or they're completely anti-Russian. Like, all of that is out the window. Like, just thinking of, like, if I made that documentary on Ukraine versus doing it on Saudi or Yemen, and then just listening to the conversations, like, that would never have gone through the script. Like, I couldn't have put that in the script. It's impossible. And it's just like, oh my God. Like,
and I'm sure you guys living in exile can relate to the challenges that anyone faces when they have to leave their home and be forced out of their own country or their homeland where they've grown up and, as I said initially, created their identities. This discussion could go on forever and ever, and I will definitely get back to you guys on more. But before I let you guys go, I would just see if you guys have any concluding remarks or anything about the role of independent journalism, and how can then we do independent journalism? How independent from, as Safa mentioned, the Western gaze and the stereotypes, independent from, as Taha mentioned, labels or are being used or appropriated for as poster people to for their own, or as Bilal said, about the difficulty and the monitoring and the surveillance that goes on, and the lack of collaboration. So how can journalists in exile keep going on? And just a concluding remarks from all three of you. Maybe we can start with you, Safa, and then move to Taha and Bilal.
No, have Bilal start.
Or whoever, yeah.
She was more optimistic.
Yeah, and I know it's good to be optimistic, but I understand that sometimes it can be very difficult. Bilal mentioned,
I mean, at this time, I don't know, like now just watching Palestine and what's happening there, and I'm beyond, I have no words for like the feelings of, yet again, we're watching genocide and watching the journalists absolutely fucking fail in basic knowledge. Question everyone, question everything. I'm not saying pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli. Just put on your brain, use it, and be critical of the information that's coming in. Like, I think there's a general crisis that is not just the exiled one, of what journalism should be now in the age of social media, right? And I don't think that question has been answered. We're all lost as journalists because as institutions, we're no longer preserving what they claim to be the morals of journalism. All of that has gone to the side. And no longer are NGOs or huge organizations that used to fund and support independent media doing it in the same way. All of those are now in crisis as well. And so we're really at this pivotal moment of, can you sustain journalism as a career, right? And still be able to do this kind of work. And I mean, I have no answer for this right now because I'm living this existential crisis as I watch what's going on now and watch how things are being covered and not being covered at all. Like the two extremes of, I'm sorry, of like what's happening with the earthquake in Afghanistan. There is enough attention in my brain to hold different things in different regions in my brain. Like I can read different things from different places, right? I think there's a dumbing down from news organizations themselves. It's like, oh, if there's something happening in Palestine, there's no room for anything else to happen. So there's more value to this area than to something else. And that's really damaging. Like I have talked to people now, most of my coverage is on Yemen and the Yemen war, not on Saudi. People now, after 8 years of war, don't know there was a war in Yemen. But where's the failure? It's not the failure of the people themselves, but because the media organizations deemed it the forgotten war and forgot about it. Like they actively, like the commissioning editors are the ones who forgot about the war. It's not the people. Yeah, and I assure you the Yemenis have not forgotten about the war, right? But there is such a insidious way that racism, the white gaze, colonialism, post-colonialism, it's not even, we're not even post, right? Of who is worthy of our attention and why, and then immediately gaslight them when they've lost interest in it, when the conversation is suddenly uncomfortable for them and they don't want to go to that, right? Especially within talking about Palestine and talking about colonialism, settler colonialism, what's going on, what's the bigger context. Let's ask more important questions that lead us to where we are now. They don't want to have these conversations. They want to talk about Native Americans in America now because there's no way for them to actually get them the land back. Then they talk about, oh, let's mention the tribes that used to be here because we already genocided them. So it's safe now to acknowledge their.
Tell me more about it. In Australia, we just lost the referendum for the voice for the indigenous in the parliament.
Which is shocking, right? Yes, because they're too afraid to do that, right? It's useful when they're not alive anymore, when they're too few people. And that to me is like, that might be the only optimistic thing I can say. We are on this moment where things are no longer sustainable. Capitalism, the way it is now, within the global collapse of the climate, right? That's not sustainable. Colonialism now is not sustainable. Racism is not sustainable. There is a conversation that's happening now that hasn't happened before collectively, right? What that will look for us, I don't know, like we're obsessed with, MBS and stuff in Saudi, but maybe climate change will kill us before he does. And like we need to think differently now about all of this.
And about the way we do journalism as well.
With it, right? Because where are the, I mean, how many journalists do you know, does everybody know, who stopped reading the news? We stopped reading the news, right? Everybody else has stopped way before us, but we're so traumatized and tired. Nobody wants to read the news now, right?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Bilal, I'll come to you. You mentioned citizen journalism. So do you think that's the future? Citizen journalism, is that the most independent we can get in collecting information?
To be honest with you, I don't think anything is a future. I think future is very fluid these days. but it's a prevalent reality because you live in an age where the standard sort of attention span is 5 seconds, and thanks to Donald Trump, basically, um, for sort of making that go viral. However, there was one lesson for me from the first from the Hamas attacks against Israeli civilians. Obviously, this is a war. There are causes. There's a history, and then later on, the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza and the killings of hundreds of civilians, including children. That I felt that there was a sort of epic failure in terms of not pointing out that, okay, two wrongs don't make it right. Not every Palestinian is Hamas. It's a little bit like saying every Afghan or every Pashtun in Afghanistan is a Talib, right? That was number one. But at the same time, I also saw the other sort of extreme, which was, no regard for Israeli civilians. And I mean, look at it, the West and the Muslim world, look at it at the leadership sort of level, right? You don't see anything constructive. You see both sides are sort of reacting in a wave of emotions. But I happen to actually agree with King Abdullah of Jordan that there is this thinking these days that Arab lives and Arab children are less important than the Israeli one. And I think this is where media organization in the West have done a terrible job. And instead, what is the job of media outlets? And I don't want to sort of not recognize the brilliant work that my colleagues are doing, those that I know and those that I don't know. But some of the commentary is sort of very inflammatory, right? And let's face it, we do share a world where Arabs and Israelis, they live not only in that region, but around the world. And it is our job at the end of the day to basically put things into perspective and tell the world, actually, and tell the audiences that what is the reality, and I saw part of that failure with the Afghanistan coverage. There were snippets of it, but we saw more of that when the Taliban took over. It was sort of this adrenaline rush, and you saw suddenly a generation of Western YouTubers. To this day, they do go, and yes, Afghanistan is good for them because there's hashish and mountains and there's landscape, and there's this and there's that. But this is also a country that is a present for its women, for its children, for its people. And if the last 20 years of the coverage taught me one thing in Afghanistan, we failed to basically pay attention to the sufferings of people in the villages and rural areas under the Republic, right? We were okay if the Americans were carrying out raids, the former Afghan government, and civilians were getting killed. And this is now the other extreme. So let's hope that, if I can call it that, that we get out of these extremities, right? And some common sense prevails. But the world is a sad place. I mean, let's face it. There are so many challenges, from COVID to economic sort of crises to the issue of disinformation. My colleague mentioned sort of digital security. I'm a father to two young daughters, and people actually did put my daughter's picture and they didn't like my coverage. So now I have to be sort of more protective. I can't share the second daughter's sort of arrival or picture on social media. It's just not Twitter, right? It's your Instagram. It can be a network of people you think they're your friends or your social media contacts. So, we are very vulnerable at the end of the day. And I understand that I've got privilege now for 2 years. I live in Canada. I don't face the same risks that my colleagues would be facing in Afghanistan, right? So I'm all very well aware of that. But let's hope that the media as a whole, these television stations, newspapers, they do a better job. It's just not basically, rush to one place, cover it sort of, for a few weeks,
Yeah.
because it suits you, and then sort of forget about it, right?
Thanks, Bilal. I'm so sorry to hear that your daughter's pictures were used. That's that's horrible. Taha will conclude the webinar on your comment, but I would, in addition to what you would like to say, I would also like to ask. We understand that there's a lot of political economy of the media. We know who owns it, the money, where it comes from, the policies that are made, and all the lobbying and the politics around it. We understand that very well. All journalists around the world understand that. So while knowing and acknowledging those issues that can restrain freedom of press, and that can restrain freedom of voice or visibility, or what do you think can then be done to be able to do independent journalism and bring all sides of perspective, while keeping yourself safe? Is there something we can do?
I mean, one of the things, as I, grow older and continue to do journalism, I realize this idea of, independent journalism, impartial journalism. This is sort of, more of a myth that, that we've been told that this exists, but it doesn't really exist. As when we see, and the media continues to expose itself in that way by taking positions. I think what is very important, and this is what I continue to say repeatedly, is media literacy, which is something that we need more and more today. We need to, the coming generations, our children, or the younger generation, we need to teach them how to discern from what is good information, what is bad information, where the information is coming from, who are the, perpetrators behind this, who are the ones who are promoting this information. And that all requires media literacy and a critical analysis of the media, but not by rejecting everything like Trump did by calling everything fake news. We have to be careful of that too. But at the same time, we need to know, where does the New York Times come from when it comes to its so-called independent editorial decision making? Where does Fox News stand for? Because these are all media outlets, whether it's Fox, Sky News, Guardian, New York Times, or small outlets like The Intercept in the US or Declassified in the UK. Or you hear about these with Afghanistan, there's this organization called Afghanistan International that I've heard of. They're like, I guess, I mean, perhaps they're like human rights organizations from Saudi Arabia. We need to sort of like look at the backing and the funding and the sponsoring, and how transparent these organizations are about that, and educate people about that. And I think once we can educate people about this, and sort of and include that at a very young age, I think we should start educating people about media literacy at a very young age. Should not wait until they're in the university and then take up media as a studies. Media is a part of our daily consumption, of our daily lives, and it impacts us on a daily basis. So we should have it from a very early stage in our life, where we need to have the tools and the capacity to understand what is media. When this reporter is talking on Al Jazeera TV, where is he coming from? If he's talking on TRT, where is he coming from, or where they're coming from? Or if they're talking on BBC, where they're coming from? And I think that media literacy is what is lacking today, and that is what is destroying the journalism industry. Because there is this sort of, now everybody has taken these positions and they're becoming so polarized. So I know people who are like only watching, in Pakistan, for example, they will only watch ARY because they think that Geo is lying, or they will only watch Geo because they think ARY is lying. But this whole sort of polarization, and then who does it benefit? It benefits people in power. And that's why I think we need media literacy. And I think that's the only thing that I could advise to anyone listening and watching this, is that we need to educate people about how the media operates in a better way. Because even as journalists, sometimes we don't understand it, and sometimes we get used by it. And sometimes because we have this urge of telling the story, because we want to tell the story. So we're like, okay, we will tell the story, even if this is a Qatari funded media group, or if this is a British broadcasting, British government funded group, or whatever. We still go ahead and report because we want to tell the story. But we need to keep in mind that there are these lobbies, pressure groups, this sort of background and history behind all of this media outlets, and that needs to be, communicated to everyone who's consuming this.
Thank you so much, Taha. I've personally learned a lot from all of you, and I wish that we can continue having these discussions at other platforms and off work as well. So Safa, Bilal, and Taha, thank you so much. I know that you are all joining me from different parts of the world, so really appreciate your time and the insights that you've offered here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.